I turned 18 in early spring, the kind of week where nothing feels different except the way people talk to you. Suddenly, every sentence had the word adult in it, usually followed by responsibility. My parents didn't throw me out in one dramatic moment. There was no shouting match, no bags on the porch. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. It started with comments, little ones, my mom asking if I had thought about my next step. My dad reminding me that plenty of kids move out at 18. They said it like it was trivia, not a warning. Then one evening after dinner, my dad cleared his throat and said we needed to talk. That phrase never means anything good. They told me I had a few weeks to figure something out. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because I was lazy, but because my sister needed space. Lily was 16 in high school, and according to my parents, very sensitive. She needed a calm environment to focus on her studies. Me being around apparently made things stressful. No one explained how. I wasn't loud. I worked part-time. I stayed out of trouble. But somehow my presence was the problem. They framed it as logic, not rejection. I was legally an adult now. It was time to stand on my own. They said this while sitting in the house I had grown up in at the same table where I did homework for years. My sister didn't say much. She just stared at her phone, scrolling like the conversation had nothing to do with her. I remember asking a simple question. So where am I supposed to go? My mom said I'd figure it out. The same way people always do. That was it. No backup plan. No offer of help. Just a timeline. 2, maybe 3 weeks. After that, the house felt different. Not hostile. Just colder. My sister started leaving her stuff spread across shared spaces like she was already claiming more room. My parents stopped including me in small decisions. Dinner plans. Grocery lists. It was subtle but clear. I was already halfway gone. I packed slowly. Mostly because I didn't have much to pack. Clothes, a few books, things I could fit into my car. Every item I put into a box felt like proof that this wasn't temporary, that they weren't going to change their minds. What made it worse was how normal everyone acted. My parents still asked how work was, still reminded me to lock the door. But the message underneath never changed. This was no longer my place. On my last night there, I slept on a bare mattress. My room echoed. I lay awake listening to my sister laugh on the phone down the hall. She sounded relaxed, comfortable, exactly what my parents wanted. The next morning, my dad hugged me and said this would be good for me. My mom reminded me to call. Lily didn't come outside. I drove away with the kind of knot in my stomach that doesn't loosen when you breathe. I stayed with a friend at first, then another. I learned how quickly, of course, you can stay turns into awkward silence. I worked extra shifts, saved every dollar, ate whatever was cheap and filling. Meanwhile, whenever I stopped by my parents' house to grab mail, everything looked the same. The lights were on. The fridge was full. My sister's car was always in the driveway. No one asked how I was managing. They assumed I was fine because I didn't complain. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing how hard it was. Lily, on the other hand, started thriving, at least on the surface. New clothes, new phone. My parents talked about her future like it was a group project they were all excited about. College plans, tutoring, test prep. None of that had ever come up for me. When I brought up money once, my dad said something that stuck. He said, "You're stronger than your sister. You can handle more." At the time, I didn't argue. I just nodded. Strength, I learned, was code for not needing help, or maybe not being worth it. By the time I realized staying close to home wasn't going to work, I was already tired. Tired of couch surfing. Tired of pretending I was fine. I needed something stable. Something that didn't depend on whether someone felt generous that week. That was when I started thinking seriously about leaving town altogether. Not to make a point. Not to punish anyone. Just to survive without constantly feeling like I was one inconvenience away from nowhere to sleep. I didn't tell my parents right away. I needed to be sure. I needed a plan that didn't rely on them changing or suddenly noticing me again. Lily was still living comfortably under their roof, worried about grades and social drama. I was learning how fast adulthood shows up when you're not invited to stay a kid. The night I finally decided what I was going to do, I sat alone in my car, outside my friend's apartment, engine off, radio silent. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad in a dramatic way. I was focused. The kind of focus you get when you understand something clearly for the first time. Whatever happened next, I couldn't afford to depend on people who had already decided I was optional. I kept my foot on the gas longer than I needed to, like slowing down might give me time to second-guess myself. The city blurred past my windshield while I ran through numbers in my head. Rent I couldn't afford, hours I'd need to work, favors I was already running out of. Independence sounded great until it came with receipts. I learned quickly that crashing for a bit has an expiration date. The first friend was generous. The second was polite. By the third couch, I could feel the tension every time I came home late from work. Nobody said anything outright, but I knew the look. The one that means they're counting days. I picked up more shifts. Closed when I could, opened when I had to. I said yes to everything because no one was there to catch me if I said no. My car became my backup plan. I kept a blanket in the trunk just in case. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. My parents didn't check in. Not really. When they did call, it was casual. My mom asked if I was settling in. My dad reminded me to be careful with money. The same people who decided I could figure it out on my own were suddenly full of advice. I kept my answers short. Fine, busy, managing. Lily, meanwhile, posted pictures of new shoes and school events. My mom shared them online with captions about how proud she was. I stared at my phone one night after a double shift, hands smelling like cleaning solution, and laughed. Not because it was funny, because if I didn't, I might have thrown the phone across the room. I tried looking for a cheap room to rent. Most places wanted deposits I didn't have. Some landlords stopped responding once they heard my age. I understood. 18 looked risky on paper. No rental history, no safety net, just promises. That was when someone at work mentioned the military. Not in a patriotic speech kind of way, just a fact. You get housing, paycheck, benefits, it's steady. I brushed it off at first. I wasn't thinking about uniforms or deployments. I was thinking about a bed that was actually mine, a door I could close without wondering if I was overstaying my welcome. The idea didn't leave me alone. It followed me through late shifts and empty refrigerators. I looked it up online between orders. Read the basics. Contracts, training, commitments. Nothing sounded easy, but none of it sounded unstable either. I didn't tell my parents. There was no reason to. This wasn't a family decision. It was a logistics problem, and I needed a solution that didn't depend on anyone's mood. I met with a recruiter on my lunch break. He didn't try to sell me a dream. He talked about structure, expectations, what I'd owe and what I'd get in return. It was transactional in a way that felt honest. That night I sat in my car again, staring at the dashboard, thinking about what it would mean to leave. Not just my town, but the idea that home was something I could rely on. I realized I had already let go of that. This was just putting it into action. The paperwork moved faster than I expected. There were forms, tests, waiting rooms that smelled like old coffee. I checked boxes, signed lines. Every step felt oddly calm, like I had stopped hoping for a different outcome and started building one instead. When I finally told my parents, it was after everything was already in motion. My mom sounded surprised. My dad asked if I was sure. Neither offered to help me stay. That answer alone confirmed I was doing the right thing. Lily had opinions. She said the military was extreme, that I didn't need to go that far. I didn't bother explaining that that far was exactly what stability looked like from where I was standing. The last few weeks before I left were a blur of shifts and checklists. I sold what I didn't need, gave away what I couldn't take. I kept my expectations low and my plans tight. No goodbye tour, no dramatic send-off. On my final day at work, my manager shook my hand and said good luck. That meant more than I expected. It was the first time in months someone acknowledged I was stepping into something hard, instead of just assuming I'd be fine. I drove out of town before sunrise. The road was empty, the sky still dark. I didn't feel brave. I felt committed. There's a difference. Bravery is optional. Commitment is not. Somewhere between the city limits and the highway, something shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was focused on what was ahead because looking back didn't offer much. By the time the sun came up, I had already accepted one thing: whatever the military turned out to be, it couldn't be worse than living with the constant reminder that my place in my own family had conditions attached. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and kept driving, not because I was running away, but because standing still had stopped being an option. The bus doors folded shut behind me with a sound that made turning around feel pointless. I stood there with a duffel bag that held everything I owned, surrounded by strangers who looked just as unsure as I felt, and realized no one cared why I was there. They only cared if I could keep up. Basic training didn't ease anyone in. It stripped things down fast. Sleep was rationed. Privacy disappeared. Comfort wasn't part of the schedule. The rules were simple, though. Show up on time. Follow instructions. Don't make excuses. After months of chaos, the clarity was almost comforting. I wasn't the fastest or the loudest. I didn't try to be. I focused on doing things right the first time. When other people complained, I stayed quiet and finished the task. That habit followed me everywhere. It turns out instructors noticed that. Being a woman didn't earn me special treatment. If anything, it meant fewer second chances. I heard comments. I got tested more. I learned quickly that the easiest way to shut that down was consistency. When you stop giving people reasons to doubt you, they eventually move on to someone else. The first time I got singled out wasn't for failing. It was because my paperwork was clean when everyone else's was a mess. Small win, but I took it. In a place where nothing belonged to you, competence felt like property. The structure helped more than I expected. Meals happened on schedule. Paychecks arrived on time. Housing was handled. No one asked where I came from or why I joined. My past stopped being relevant. For the first time since turning 18, I wasn't improvising my life day by day. I learned how to manage stress without drama. You didn't get rewarded for big emotions. You got rewarded for solutions. That mindset stuck. Problems became tasks. Tasks became routines. Routines became progress. Deployment came sooner than I imagined. Not the kind people picture in movies. Long hours. Tight timelines. Responsibility without applause. I wasn't kicking down doors. I was making sure things ran the way they were supposed to, because when they didn't, everything backed up. That was where I found my rhythm. I could take pressure without panicking. I could follow through. I could be counted on. My supervisor noticed. Not with speeches, just trust. More responsibility. Fewer reminders. That meant more to me than praise. While I was settling into this new version of myself, my family stayed exactly where I left them. Calls from home were brief. My mom asked about food and weather. My dad asked if I was saving money. Neither asked how I felt about being thousands of miles away. I stopped expecting them to. Lily called once bored, asking if I had met anyone famous. I told her no. She sounded disappointed. She asked when I was visiting. I said I wasn't sure. That answer ended the conversation. Money changed everything quietly. For the first time, I wasn't guessing what my balance would look like. I could plan. I could save. I learned how to live within limits because the system demanded it. There was no impulse spending, no lifestyle upgrades, just steady ground. I sent some money home. Not because anyone asked, because I could. It felt like the right thing to do. A few hundred here and there. Utilities, groceries, nothing dramatic. I told myself it was temporary. A way to help without getting pulled back in. The military didn't make me softer or harder. It made me clearer. Clear about effort. Clear about responsibility. Clear about what happens when you don't show up prepared. I started seeing my past differently, not with anger, but with distance. I stopped feeling embarrassed about where I came from. Survival isn't a flaw. It's a skill. And I had gotten very good at it. Promotions didn't come overnight. They came the way everything else did. Incrementally. Earned. Each one came with more expectations and less patience for excuses. I liked that. It matched how I already lived. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I wasn't waiting for the floor to drop out. I had a schedule, a role, people who relied on me because I did my job, not because we shared a last name. That sense of stability changed how I talked to my parents. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I gave updates when asked and left it at that. When my mom mentioned Lily's plans, I listened without reacting. Lily's life sounded busy. Classes, friends, trips I couldn't picture fitting into my old budget. My parents filled in the gaps. They always had. I noted it without judgment, the same way I tracked everything else now. One night after a long shift, I looked at my bank account and realized something simple. I wasn't stuck anymore. Not financially, not emotionally. I had options. That didn't mean I planned to use them recklessly. It meant I didn't have to say yes out of fear. I shut my laptop and leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the building around me. The military hadn't saved me. I had done the work. It just gave me a place where that work actually counted. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt steady, like knowing the ground would still be there when you put your foot down and trusting yourself enough to keep moving without checking every step. My phone buzzed during a break, and I already knew who it was before I checked. Calls from home followed a pattern. Short updates, small talk, news that never quite lined up with the life I was living. Lily sounded excited. She always did. She talked fast, jumping from one thing to the next like momentum was proof that everything was going well. New classes, new friends, a weekend trip she was planning. I listened while leaning against a concrete wall, boot-still dusty uniforms stiff from the day. Our worlds didn't overlap anymore. She asked what I'd been up to. I gave the simple version. Work. Long hours. Same routine. That usually ended her interest. It wasn't dramatic enough. After I hung up, I stared at the screen for a second longer than I meant to. Not because I was jealous, because the contrast was impossible to ignore. While my days were measured in schedules and responsibilities, hers were measured in upgrades. The updates kept coming. My mom mentioned Lily changing majors, then changing back. My dad joked about how expensive textbooks had gotten. There was always a laugh at the end, like money was inconvenient but manageable. I didn't ask how. I already knew. I started noticing how often Lily's name came up in conversations about finances. Tuition deposits, rent increases, a broken phone replaced without hesitation. None of it was framed as a problem. Just part of supporting your child. When the topic turned to me, it shifted. My parents told people how proud they were that I was so independent. That word followed me everywhere. It sounded like praise. It felt like a disclaimer. Independent meant not needing help. Independent meant not asking questions. I didn't argue. I sent money when I could. At first it was for specific things. Utilities, groceries, something unexpected. Then it became routine. A set amount every month. Enough to help, not enough to disrupt my own stability. I treated it like a bill. I never told Lily directly. The money went through my parents. That was deliberate. I wasn't trying to play hero. I was maintaining distance. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted quiet. Lily's lifestyle kept expanding anyway. Better apartment, better car, photos online that made it look effortless. I recognized the pattern. Everything was always just slightly beyond her reach, and someone else always filled the gap. Once my mom mentioned Lily was stressed about money. I asked what she meant. She laughed and said Lily just worried a lot. That was it. No details. No concern. Stress in their house meant inconvenience, not consequence. Meanwhile, my own spending stayed flat. Same routines. Same priorities. I learned how much peace came from not stretching yourself thin. I learned that boredom wasn't the enemy. Instability was. The more disciplined my life became, the more obvious the imbalance looked. Lily wasn't reckless in a dramatic way. She was insulated. She made decisions without calculating risk because risk had never landed on her. I didn't resent her. Not directly. I resented the system that kept telling her the floor would always catch her. I resented being cast as the safety net without being consulted. There were moments when the irony felt almost funny. My parents had pushed me out because I was old enough to be responsible. Now that responsibility seemed to include funding the consequences of someone else's choices. I started keeping records, not out of suspicion, out of habit. Dates, amounts, notes. It was how I stayed organized everywhere else in my life. This wasn't emotional. It was administrative. My supervisor once joked that I treated everything like a checklist. I didn't correct him. Checklists don't lie. They also don't forget. During one deployment call, Lily complained about how hard it was to balance everything. I asked what she meant by everything. She said school social life bills. I almost laughed. Not because it was easy, because it was vague. I asked if she was working. She said she was thinking about it. That answer floated in the silence between us. Thinking about it meant it wasn't urgent. Not yet. When I got off the call, I went back to work without comment. Complaints sound different when you've learned how optional they can be. The family dynamic stayed polite. No fights, no confrontations, just assumptions layered on top of each other. I was the capable one. Lily was the one who needed support. That story didn't change even as the numbers did. My parents never asked if the money was a burden. They assumed it wasn't because I didn't say it was. Silence, I learned, is easy to misinterpret as consent. I didn't correct them. Not yet. I was still operating under the idea that this arrangement had an endpoint, that eventually Lily would stabilize, that my role would taper off naturally. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became that no one else was planning for that outcome. Stability in my family wasn't a goal for Lily. It was a guarantee. One evening after finishing paperwork, I reviewed my budget out of routine. Income, savings, transfers, everything made sense individually. Together it formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I wasn't being asked to help in emergencies. I was being used to smooth over habits. That wasn't support. That was maintenance. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. Alert enough to notice how often my parents talked about Lily's future without mentioning effort. Alert enough to hear expectation where they called it family. I closed my laptop and stood up, stretching out stiffness from the day. Outside, the air was cool and quiet. The kind of quiet that gives you space to think clearly without rushing. I understood something then, not as a conclusion, but as a fact settling into place. As long as I stayed predictable, nothing in my family would change. And predictability for the first time felt like a choice instead of a virtue. I didn't notice the pattern all at once. It showed up quietly buried in routine. A transfer here, a check there, a reminder on my calendar that repeated itself every month without asking how I felt about it. Sending money had become automatic. I treated it like another fixed expense, no different from insurance or phone service. The amount never changed, and neither did the expectation. No one thanked me anymore. No one explained why it was needed. The assumption was that I would handle it. Whenever my parents called, the conversation followed the same track. My mom would start with small talk, then slide into updates about Lily's life. Something was always happening. A new apartment, a class she needed to retake, a car repair that couldn't wait. The details shifted, but the tone stayed light, like these were normal inconveniences everyone dealt with. If I asked questions, the answers were vague. Things are just expensive right now. You know how it is. I did know how it was. I also knew how to budget, how to delay purchases, how to say no. Those options never came up when Lily was involved. I realized no one was asking Lily to adjust her lifestyle. They were asking me to subsidize it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been pushed out at 18 because I was old enough to manage on my own. Lily was now well into her 20s, and independence still wasn't part of the conversation. She wasn't failing. She was floating. Every time I wired money, I told myself it was temporary. That eventually, she'd settle into something steady. That my parents would ease off once she found her footing. It was easier to believe that than to admit this had become a long-term arrangement without my input. The calls from Lily grew more frequent. Not to ask for money directly. She was careful about that. She complained instead. About stress. About feeling overwhelmed. About how hard it was to keep up. I listened, nodding, even though she couldn't see me. Once she joked that I was lucky. Lucky to have everything so structured. I didn't correct her. Structure doesn't feel like luck when it's the only thing keeping you balanced. I noticed how rarely anyone asked about my work beyond surface level. Deployments came and went. Promotions happened quietly. My parents would mention being proud in passing like it was an accessory detail, not the center of my life. What mattered more was whether I could help out a little more this month. Whether it was a bad time for me, whether my expenses had changed. Those questions never made the script. The longer it went on, the less emotional it felt. That worried me. I wasn't angry, I wasn't hurt. I was detached. Detachment is efficient, but it's also dangerous. It lets things continue without resistance. I started reviewing my transfers the way I reviewed everything else. Dates, totals, trends, the numbers didn't lie. Over time, the money I'd sent added up to more than I'd spent on myself in years. Not because I was generous, because I was consistent. One evening after a long day, I caught myself calculating how much longer I could keep it up. Not whether I should. How long? That was the moment something shifted. This wasn't about helping family in a crisis. This was about maintaining an imbalance because it was familiar. Because changing it would make people uncomfortable. And I had spent most of my life absorbing discomfort to keep peace. I thought back to the day my parents asked me to leave. How calmly they'd explained that it was time for me to be responsible. How confidently they'd said I'd figure it out. That logic hadn't applied to Lily. Not then. Not now. I wasn't jealous of her. I didn't want her life. I wanted fairness. Or at least honesty. If I was expected to contribute, I wanted to know why the rules were different. I tested the waters once, asked my mom if Lily had considered downsizing. She laughed like I'd made a joke. That would stress her out, she said. She has enough going on. That answer stuck with me. Stress in our family was something to be avoided for Lily at all costs. For me, it was character building. I didn't push the issue. Pushing never worked. I filed the information away and kept observing. Family drama doesn't always show up as yelling. Sometimes it's just a series of quiet assumptions no one challenges. I realized I was being positioned carefully. Not as a sibling, not as a daughter, as a resource, a reliable one. The kind you don't thank because you assume it will always be there. The humor in it came late one night when I read an article about financial boundaries. It wasn't aimed at people like me. It was written for parents supporting adult children. The advice sounded familiar. Encourage independence. Set limits. Avoid enabling. I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was painfully accurate. The only difference was that the enabling wasn't coming from my parents' bank account anymore. It was coming from mine. I closed the article and stared at the ceiling, running through the logic again. I wasn't being irresponsible by helping, but I was being taken for granted. Those two things aren't the same. The next call from home came right on schedule. My mom sounded rushed. Lily had something coming up. Nothing urgent, just timing. I listened without interrupting, already knowing where the conversation was heading. As she talked, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not anger, not guilt, clarity. The kind that strips emotion out of a problem and leaves you with choices. I didn't say anything yet. I let her finish. I let the silence stretch just long enough to notice. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to fill it. The call came in the middle of a normal afternoon. No warning, no build-up. Just my mom's name on the screen, followed by the familiar sense that this wasn't a check-in. She didn't waste time. After a quick hello, she said Lily needed help. Not help like groceries or rent. Help like a decision had already been made and now required funding. Lily wanted to buy a car. Not a cheap one. Not something reliable and boring. Something newer. Something that made sense for her lifestyle. My mom said it like she was reading from a brochure. I asked what happened to Lily's current car. There was a pause. Then my dad jumped on the call. He explained that it was old, unreliable, and not worth fixing. He talked about safety, about convenience, about how stressful it was for Lily to worry about transportation. No one mentioned a budget. They didn't ask if I could help. They assumed I would. The conversation moved straight to numbers. Monthly payments, insurance, how much they could cover versus what was left. My name was already factored in. I waited for the part where they asked what I thought. It never came. When I finally spoke, I asked a simple question. How much has Lily saved? Silence. Then my mom said Lily had been busy. School, life, stress. The same list recycled. I asked again, slower. Has she saved anything? My dad cleared his throat. He said this wasn't about savings. It was about family stepping in when someone needed support. That was the moment the whole thing snapped into focus. This wasn't an emergency. This was an upgrade. A lifestyle choice. And I was being handed the bill because I was the easiest option. I told them I wasn't paying for a car. Not part of it. Not the down payment. Not the insurance. Nothing. My mom sounded confused, like I'd misheard her. She repeated herself slower this time. Lily needed reliable transportation. As her sister, I should want to help. I reminded them of something they had told me years ago. That 18 was old enough to take responsibility for your own life. That struggling builds character. That people figure things out when they have to. Lily was 26. That didn't go over well. My dad said I was being harsh. My mom said I didn't understand how hard things were for Lily. I said I understood perfectly. I just didn't agree that her stress was mine to solve. They shifted tactics. They talked about how much I made now, how stable my job was, how lucky I was. They said helping Lily wouldn't really affect me. I told them that wasn't the point. The point was that no one had asked Lily to adjust anything. The plan was for me to absorb the cost so she didn't have to feel uncomfortable. That's when my mom said it. The sentence that explained everything. You're stronger than her. You can handle it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I said no again. Clear, direct, final. Lily took the phone at some point. She didn't sound desperate. She sounded annoyed. She said I was making a big deal out of nothing. That families help each other. That I was acting like money mattered more than people. I told her money mattered because it reflected choices. And I wasn't willing to fund hers anymore. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a dismissive one. Like I was bluffing. I didn't correct her. When the call ended, I sat there longer than usual, staring at the wall. Not shaking, not upset. Just processing the fact that I had finally said something out loud that I'd been thinking for years. The reaction was immediate. Texts, missed calls, messages from my mom saying I'd misunderstood. From my dad saying we needed to talk. Lily sent a message that just said, "Wow." I didn't respond. That night I opened my laptop and pulled up my budget. I looked at the transfers, the recurring amounts, the totals. Everything was there in black and white. I wrote an email. Not emotional, not dramatic, just clear. I explained that I would no longer be contributing to Lily's expenses beyond what I was already sending. I explained that if the pressure continued, I would stop all financial support entirely. Not as punishment, as a boundary. I read it twice. Then I sent it. The reply came fast. My mom said I was overreacting. My dad said we'd talk later. Lily didn't reply at all. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Then the comments started. About how the military had changed me. About how I used to be different. About how I was forgetting where I came from. None of it addressed the actual issue. No one explained why Lily couldn't buy a cheaper car. No one suggested she work more hours. No one mentioned adjusting expectations. They just kept circling back to me. I stayed calm. I showed up to work. I followed my routine. I didn't vent. I didn't justify myself to anyone who hadn't asked. Inside, something had shifted. I wasn't bracing for fallout anymore. I was watching it form. For the first time, I wasn't the backup plan. I wasn't smoothing over someone else's decisions. I had removed myself from the equation, and it was clear no one else knew what to do yet. The pressure didn't stop. It just changed shape. And with every message that came in, one thing became more obvious than the last. They had never considered the possibility that I meant what I said. I stopped answering the phone after the third call in one afternoon. Not because I was busy, but because I'd already said everything that needed to be said. Repeating myself wouldn't make it clearer. It would just turn it into a negotiation, and I wasn't interested in that. The messages kept coming anyway. My mom switched between concern and disappointment. My dad focused on tone, telling me we needed to talk this through like adults. Lily stayed quiet for a day, then resurfaced with a message that said I was being dramatic. That word again, dramatic. It was always used when I refused to play along. I didn't block anyone. I didn't announce anything. I just slowed my responses down until they stopped expecting immediate access to me. That alone seemed to make them more uncomfortable than my actual refusal. I reread the email I'd sent and noticed how plain it was. No accusations. No history lesson. Just a line drawn where there hadn't been one before. I realized how rare that had been in my family. Boundaries were usually emotional. This one was procedural. My parents treated it like a phase. My mom asked if work was stressing me out. My dad hinted that I might regret this later. Neither of them addressed the substance of what I'd said. They talked around it like acknowledging it directly would make it real. Lily took a different approach. She sent me a long message explaining how hard things were for her, how overwhelmed she felt, how unfair it was that I'd chosen now to pull back. She reminded me of everything she was dealing with, none of which included changing her plans. I read it once, then again, then I put the phone down. The problem wasn't that she was struggling. The problem was that her struggle came with a built-in assumption that someone else would absorb the impact, that someone had always been me. I responded briefly. I told her I wasn't pulling back. I was stepping out. There was a difference. She replied with a laughing emoji. Then another message. You won't actually stop helping. You always say this. That was useful information. I forwarded the message to my email and archived it. Not out of spite, out of clarity. It confirmed something I'd already suspected. They didn't think I was serious. They thought this was a moment I'd cool off from. I didn't correct them. Instead, I adjusted my calendar. I removed the recurring transfer reminder. I noted the date I'd given them as notice. 60 days. Enough time to adapt. Enough time for no one to claim they were blindsided. I didn't announce the countdown. I let it exist quietly. At work, nothing changed. I showed up. I handled my responsibilities. I didn't talk about family. The more stable my days became, the less tolerance I had for chaos that didn't serve a purpose. One afternoon, my mom called during a meeting. When I didn't answer, she left a voicemail. Her voice sounded strained. She said she was worried about me, that she didn't recognize me anymore. I deleted it without responding. Later that evening, my dad sent a text, asking if this was really worth tearing the family apart. I stared at the words longer than I expected. Not because they hurt, but because they reframed the situation in a way that benefited him. I hadn't torn anything apart. I'd stepped back from propping it up. I replied once, I'm not doing this to hurt anyone. I'm doing it to stop being responsible for choices that aren't mine. That message didn't get a response. The silence after that was different. Heavier. Less performative. My parents weren't trying to persuade me anymore. They were recalculating. Lily broke the quiet with a phone call late one night. I answered out of habit. She sounded irritated, not emotional. She said my parents were stressed, that I was making things harder than they needed to be. I asked her what she had changed since the conversation about the car. She didn't answer right away. Then she said she hadn't had time to think about it yet. I told her that was the issue. She accused me of abandoning her. I told her I wasn't her backup plan. She said family doesn't work like that. I said maybe that was the problem. When the call ended, I didn't feel relieved. I felt resolved. The days passed without resolution. My mom sent articles about forgiveness. My dad sent messages about compromise. None of them mentioned budgets adjustments or accountability. They were still waiting for me to fold. I didn't. As the deadline approached, I noticed how my thoughts changed. I stopped worrying about how they'd react and started thinking about how I would. Whether I was ready to live with the fallout. Whether I'd second-guess myself. I checked my savings. I checked my expenses. Everything was fine. More than fine. The only thing at risk was a role I'd never agreed to play. One morning while reviewing my finances, I noticed how calm I felt. Not numb. Calm. like the decision had already been absorbed into my system. That calm surprised me. It meant I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of alignment. My mom called again that evening. I didn't answer. She texted instead, asking if we could just talk things through one more time. I looked at the message and realized something simple. Talking things through had always meant explaining myself until I gave in. This time there was nothing left to explain. I put the phone down and went back to what I was doing. The routine felt grounding, familiar, mine. They were still assuming I would bend. They were still operating on the version of me that filled gaps quietly and absorbed discomfort without complaint. What they didn't seem to understand was that I wasn't threatening change anymore. I had already adjusted my footing and the ground under me wasn't moving. I clicked confirm without pausing, the way you do when you've already run through every possible outcome and none of them changed the math. The screen refreshed, the transfer disappeared from my schedule, and nothing dramatic happened. No alarms, no rush of relief, just a quiet adjustment. The first few days passed without a reaction. I half expected a storm right away, but instead there was nothing. No calls, no messages. I went to work, followed my routine, and noticed how little mental space the decision actually took up. That surprised me more than anything. Then the calls started. My mom called first. Her voice was careful, like she was stepping onto thin ice. She asked if something was wrong with my bank. I said no. She asked if I'd forgotten. I said no again. That was as far as the conversation went. My dad called later that night. He skipped the pleasantries. He said he didn't understand why I was doing this. I told him I'd explained already. He said that explanation didn't feel fair. I said fairness hadn't been part of the arrangement for a long time. He told me Lily was upset. I asked what Lily had changed. He didn't answer that question either. The next message came from Lily herself. It wasn't long. Just a sentence asking if I was serious. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The absence of the transfer answered that better than words ever could. Silence does something interesting to people who are used to access. At first they assume it's temporary. Then they assume it's a mistake. When neither turns out to be true, they start scrambling for leverage. My mom tried guilt. She sent messages about family sticking together, about how she never thought I'd turn my back on them. I didn't argue with the framing. I let it sit. My dad tried logic. He sent breakdowns of Lily's expenses like that would justify the expectation. I read them carefully. Then I noticed something missing. Any mention of Lily contributing. Lily tried irritation. She said I was making her life harder than it needed to be. I almost replied to that one. Almost. Then I realized she'd said the quiet part out loud. Harder than it needed to be. Not impossible. Not unfair. Just inconvenient. That distinction mattered. I stayed consistent. I didn't block anyone, but I didn't engage beyond brief factual responses when necessary. No defending, no debating. Every interaction stayed short. At work, I felt lighter. Not happier in a dramatic sense, just less pulled in different directions. I could focus without my phone buzzing every time someone else's problem needed funding. A week passed, then 2. The tone changed. My mom's messages softened. She said she was worried about Lily, that things were tight, that maybe we could talk about a temporary solution. I didn't reply right away. When I did, I asked what adjustments Lily had made. There was a delay. Then my mom said Lily was figuring things out. That was new. My dad called again, sounding tired this time. He said Lily's car payment was behind. I asked what plan they had. He said they were trying to help where they could. I said I hoped it worked out. He didn't like that answer. The pressure ramped up in small ways. Passive comments, side remarks, references to how much easier things used to be. I noticed how often they talked about the past tense, like my support was a fixed feature that had malfunctioned. I kept my responses neutral. Calm has a way of frustrating people who are looking for an emotional opening. Lily sent a longer message one night. She said she didn't understand why I was doing this now. She said I'd always been there, that she felt blindsided. I read it twice and noticed she still hadn't asked me anything. She'd only told me how it affected her. I replied with but one sentence. I've been clear about my reasons. She didn't respond. The weeks went on. I started hearing updates indirectly. Lily was stressed. Lily was looking for extra hours. Lily was talking about selling some things. None of that came from her. It came filtered through my parents like they were testing how I'd react. I didn't react. I checked my accounts regularly. Not because I was worried, but because the absence of the transfer still felt unfamiliar. Every time I saw the higher balance, I felt a small, quiet sense of order. Not excitement. Order. My parents tried one last approach. They suggested a family call. All of us together. I declined. Group conversations had always been a way to dilute responsibility. I wasn't interested in reliving the same arguments with an audience. After that, the messages slowed down. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. No one was pretending anymore. No one was dressing up requests as concern. The arrangement had changed, and they were being forced to sit with that. I noticed how much of my energy had gone into managing expectations, anticipating reactions, softening answers. Removing that layer made everything simpler. Lily eventually called again. This time her voice sounded different, less sharp. She said things were harder than she expected. I didn't interrupt. She talked about bills, about how everything added up faster than she realized. I asked her what she planned to do. She said she was looking at cheaper options. A smaller place, a different car. The words came out slowly like they surprised her. I said that sounded responsible. She didn't thank me. She didn't apologize. But she didn't accuse me either. That was progress, even if it didn't feel like reconciliation. After the call, I went for a walk. Nothing dramatic, just movement. I thought about how long it had taken for anyone to consider adjustment instead of expectation. The world didn't end when I stopped paying. No one collapsed overnight. The system just creaked under its own weight. That was the point. I returned home and checked my phone one last time. No new messages. No demands. Just quiet. For the first time since I'd been pushed out at 18, the quiet didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like space. The updates stopped coming directly to me, but information has a way of leaking through when enough people are uncomfortable. I heard things in fragments, usually from my parents, always framed carefully, like they were trying to control how much weight each detail carried. Lily's car payment was late. Not by a day or two. Long enough to trigger calls she didn't want to answer. My dad mentioned it casually, as if it were a scheduling issue, not a warning sign. I didn't comment. I let him keep talking. He said Lily was juggling a lot. I asked what she'd cut back on. He hesitated, then said she was working on it. That phrase had replaced almost every concrete answer. A few weeks later, my mom called and asked if I'd heard from Lily. I said I hadn't. She sighed and said Lily had been stressed. I asked why. My mom said money was tight. That was new language. Tight meant the buffer was gone. Lily called me not long after that. She didn't start with small talk. She said her credit score had dropped. She didn't sound panicked. She sounded confused, like she'd assumed that number only moved in one direction. I asked what she'd missed. She said a couple of payments. I asked which ones. She said the car. I didn't say anything. Silence invites honesty when there's nowhere else to put it. She told me the lender had sent notices, that she'd ignored the first few because she thought she'd catch up. That catching up turned out to be harder than she expected. Her words came out flat, stripped of the confidence she usually carried. I asked what her plan was. She said she was thinking about refinancing, selling some things, maybe moving. Each option sounded less convincing than the last. The car went next. Not dramatically. No tow truck story. Just a sentence in the middle of a conversation. They took it. She said it like she was reporting the weather. I didn't react. I asked how she was getting to work. She said she wasn't. Not consistently. Rides fell through. Public transit took too long. Being late became a pattern. Patterns have consequences. My parents tried to fill the gap. They drove her when they could. They rearranged schedules. But they didn't have the flexibility or the money they used to. Retirement doesn't stretch the way people think it does. Lily lost her job not long after. Not because she was fired outright. Because reliability matters and she didn't have it anymore. She told me it wasn't fair. I told her employers don't grade on effort. That conversation ended quickly. The dominoes didn't fall all at once. They tipped, slowly. One bill rolled into another. Late fees stacked. Choices narrowed. The version of adulthood Lily had been protected from showed up without asking for permission. She moved out of her apartment. Downsized wasn't the word she used. Temporary was. She stayed with my parents longer than planned. That brought its own tension. Support is easier when it's theoretical. My mom called more often during that period. Not to ask for money, to talk. She sounded tired. She said she didn't know how things had gotten so complicated. I said complexity builds when consequences are delayed. She didn't disagree. Lily stopped posting online. No more pictures. No updates. The silence there felt heavier than anything she'd said out loud. Image maintenance is expensive and she no longer had the budget for it. When she did reach out, her tone was different. Less entitled. Less certain. She asked practical questions. How I budgeted. How I decided what was non-negotiable. I answered simply. I didn't lecture. She asked once if I thought she'd messed everything up. I said no. I said she'd just run out of buffers. That landed. My parents adjusted too, though more slowly. They stopped framing things as emergencies and started calling them lessons. That shift didn't come with apologies. It came with acceptance. One afternoon, my dad admitted he hadn't realized how much he'd been leaning on me. He said he thought I didn't mind. I told him I hadn't minded helping. I'd minded being assumed. He was quiet after that. Lily found another job eventually. Not glamorous, not flexible. It paid less. She complained less, too. When you're busy staying afloat, there's not much energy left for drama. She sold things she didn't need. Then things she liked. Each decision looked small on its own. Together, they changed her pace. She started thinking ahead instead of outward. We talked more during that period, but differently. No guilt, no demands, just information, updates, reality. I didn't step in. I didn't offer solutions unless she asked. That boundary held. It didn't make me cruel. It made me consistent. There were moments when my parents hinted at help again. Not directly, just comments about how hard it was to watch Lily struggle. I acknowledged the feeling without changing my stance. Struggle wasn't the enemy. Avoiding it was. Over time, the tensions settled into something quieter. Not peace. Adjustment. Lily stopped expecting rescue. My parents stopped expecting me to provide it. The system rebalanced because it had to, not because anyone wanted it to. I noticed the change in myself most clearly during a routine check-in at work. I answered questions without distraction. I focused without dividing my attention between my life and theirs. That felt new. One evening, Lily called and told me she'd found a cheaper place closer to work. She said it wasn't ideal, but it made sense. She sounded tired, grounded, real. I told her that mattered more than ideal. She agreed. After we hung up, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. The kind of steady that comes when reality finally lines up with responsibility. No one had been punished. No one had been saved. Things had simply been allowed to unfold without interference. And without me absorbing the impact, everything had changed its shape. I didn't announce anything. There was no final call, no speech, no line in the sand drawn for effect. I just noticed that my days were no longer shaped around managing someone else's expectations. That realization showed up in small ways. I stopped checking my phone during breaks. I stopped bracing before family conversations. When my parents called, I answered if I had time. If I didn't, I didn't. The urgency that used to color every interaction had faded. My relationship with them didn't end. It changed temperature. My mom talked more about herself now. Her garden, doctor appointments, friends she hadn't seen in a while. Lily came up less often, and when she did, it wasn't as a problem to be solved. Just a person figuring things out. My dad stopped offering advice about money. He asked questions instead. How I planned for retirement. How promotions worked. He listened more than he spoke. That was new. Lily and I settled into something that looked like adulthood finally. We didn't talk every week. We didn't avoid each other either. When we did talk, it was practical. She asked how I handled stress. I asked how work was going. We stayed out of each other's finances. Once she mentioned she wished she'd learned some of this earlier. I said learning late still counted. She didn't argue. I noticed how different our conversations felt without an audience. No parents listening in. No pressure to perform roles. Just two people comparing notes on lives that had taken very different routes. At work, things continued to move forward. Responsibility increased. Expectations sharpened. I didn't chase advancement, but I didn't avoid it either. When opportunities came up, I evaluated them based on fit, not fear. The military had taught me a lot about systems, about how they function until someone stops compensating for their flaws. My family had been a system like that. Once I stepped out of the role that kept it running smoothly, it had been forced to adjust. I thought about that often, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Walking away doesn't always mean leaving physically. Sometimes it means refusing to keep something afloat that was never meant to be your job. My parents didn't apologize in the way people imagine apologies. There was no dramatic acknowledgement of favoritism, no emotional breakdown. What they did instead was change their behavior. They stopped asking. They stopped assuming. That mattered more. One afternoon, my mom said something that stuck with me. She said she hadn't realized how much pressure she'd put on me by calling me the strong one. She said she thought it was a compliment. I told her strength isn't the same as availability. She nodded. We didn't dwell on it. Lily visited once months later. We met for coffee, neutral ground. She talked about her job, about saving for a used car this time, about checking prices instead of just liking things. I listened. I didn't correct her. I didn't add advice unless she asked. The distance between us felt healthy, not cold. After she left, I sat there a while watching people come and go. I realized I wasn't carrying resentment. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. I was just present. That surprised me. I used to think closure came from conversations, from explanations, from people admitting they were wrong. What I learned instead was that closure comes from consistency, from watching patterns change and knowing you didn't force them. My life didn't become perfect. Work got stressful. Plans changed. Some days were harder than others. The difference was that my challenges were mine. I wasn't cleaning up after choices I didn't make. I checked my savings one evening the same way I always did. The numbers looked steady, predictable. Not because I was hoarding, but because I wasn't leaking resources into expectations I'd never agreed to. I took leave later that year. Not to visit family. To rest. To do nothing on purpose. That felt like progress. When my parents asked about holiday plans, I told them I wasn't sure yet. And I meant it. Not because I was avoiding them, but because I didn't need to anchor my time around obligation anymore. They accepted that without protest. The last thing that shifted was internal. The quiet guilt I'd carried for years finally loosened. Not all at once. Gradually. As I saw that the people I'd worried about were surviving just fine without my constant intervention. Choosing myself didn't cost me my family. It changed how we related to each other. It removed the imbalance that had been passed off as love. I didn't walk away in anger. I walked away with intention. And in that space, without noise or pressure, I built a life that didn't require permission, justification, or sacrifice disguised as responsibility. Looking back, I don't see villains or heroes anymore. I see choices, patterns, and what happens when someone finally steps out of a role they were never meant to carry. My parents didn't ruin my life, and my sister didn't set out to hurt me. But the imbalance was real, and walking away from it was the only way things could change. This wasn't about punishment. It was about letting reality do what it always does when support turns into dependence. Some family revenge stories aren't loud or dramatic. They're quiet. They happen when boundaries finally replace guilt. If this story about my parents, my sister, and family drama felt real to you, consider subscribing. More family revenge stories like this are coming honest, grounded, and based on situations that actually happen every day.